This Week in Parasitism is brought to you by the American Society for Microbiology at microbeworld.org/TWiP. This Week in Parasitism, episode number 44, recorded on September 5th, 2012. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and who would be with me but Dickson Despommier?
Hello, Vincent.
I was going to say the parasitologist. What would be a good word to describe you? The premier parasitologist, PP. D cubed is P squared. How are you, Dickson?
I'm very well, thank you, Vincent.
Cloudy here in New York City today.
It is hot, muggy. We got the remnants of Isaac hanging over our heads.
Is that true?
It is. The air itself smells like the Caribbean.
Caribbean or Caribbean?
Caribbean, I think.
Currently 24 Celsius.
Yeah.
And cloudy. But
and cloudy.
Never mind the weather. TWiP goes on, doesn't it?
You bet. You bet it does.
Today we have a really interesting paper. Well, they're all interesting,
That's
of course. But this one is particularly interesting because it involves an ecosystem.
Right.
And a parasite.
Right.
And a host.
Yes.
And a lot of words I've never heard of before, which I'm hoping you will be able to explain. No, Dickson says, no, stop the recording.
No. Some of them I can explain, and some of them it will take another show just to talk about that one.
Let's start with the title of this paper.
Sure. It's
in a journal called Ecology Letters.
Right.
And I have never, ever read a paper from this journal. Have you?
In the distant past, I have, when I used to teach ecology as a subject, but I have not read anything from Ecology Letters in recent times.
The title of the paper is Nematomorph Parasites Indirectly Alter the Food Web and Ecosystem Function of Streams Through Behavioral Manipulation of Their Cricket Hosts.
Right.
Which is quite a mouthful. I can see at least 4 or 5 terms in there that we need to explain. What is a nematomorph?
Wait, let's begin by...
It looks like it's got nematode in it.
A little bit. You're absolutely right.
All right. How do you want to begin? I'm trying to manipulate you.
No, but I refuse. I'm not a cricket.
Yeah, clearly.
Let me tell you, I actually came in one morning and mentioned to you that I had seen this article, not in its entirety, but rather in an abbreviated form, as one of the picks for the editors of Science magazine.
Is that right?
This is an editor's pick. Editor's
pick, that's right. You pointed it out to me.
Right. So even they, at that level, even though they didn't publish it, they thought this was interesting.
Yeah, they had sort of a cursory review of it, right?
Yeah, they published the color version of the conclusion of the article. And so what this really is, Vince, is a bunch of people in Japan and in the United States, with the collaboration of somebody in the United States, studying the connections between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Okay? Now, do you recall sometime in the past in our TWiPing, we mentioned a concept of the ecotone. The ecotone.
I remember the ecotone. It's the border between ecosystems, right?
Correct.
So if you have a highway going through the forest...
Yes, that's what we
said. The ecotone is the edge of the highway, right?
Exactly. So they built a highway to Brasilia, the Trans-Amazonian Highway, right? And it created all kinds of havoc with the workers that constructed it because they were catching diseases that never before attacked humans, because there were no humans living in those regions before, but they still got sick from these things, like Leishmania, for instance.
Right.
Remember? So here we have a paper which studies the ecotone between the terrestrial stream bank of a freshwater river and the denizens that live within that freshwater stream. And how food webs are constructed. And food webs are very important for parasites because parasites depend on food webs.
What's a food web?
A food web. Well, let me start out by simply telling you what a food chain is, because
How about food? Now that I got.
all right.
Food I have. Food chain.
Oh yeah, food chain first. A simple food chain would be what you could find, let's say, in East Africa.
ShopRite. That's a food
That's
chain.
a chain of food stores. That's right. But you're not too far off in your thinking process in that one. Take East Africa for an example of a simple food chain. You've got the sun, which grows the grass, the gnus and the antelope and the zebras eat the grass, and then the lions and the cheetahs and the hyenas eat the grazers, and they get big and fat and lazy. And then they just sit, and leopards too, I should throw them in there as well. So you've got a simple food chain of energy to grass to grazers to carnivores. And you've just got those four things, right? That looks pretty simple. It's not
That's a
simple.
food chain.
It's not simple, but you can simplify it, all right? Now, when it gets complicated is when you start to add more biodiversity to that concept. So instead of having the sun grow grass and grazers that eat the grass and then carnivores that eat the grazers, now you might have, well, in this case, you might have parasites. The parasites infect the gut tracts of the grazers and the carnivores. And what do parasites do? They take energy away from their hosts and put it into themselves, right? So that sort of diverts the energy flow from sun to grass to grazer to carnivore. Once you start diverting energy laterally, all right, we start to talk about things that the Greeks invented a word for called trophic level. Okay, the word trophic it implies energy. So the first trophic level would be the producers. That's the plants, right? So in ecological terms, sunlight is converted to plant biomass through the action of chlorophyll, which fixes the sunlight into chemical energy, which is then applied to its biochemical cycles to produce itself, mostly starches and sugars and things like this, which the grazers take advantage of. But, Vince, you should have said, but if you look inside of a grazer, like a gnu, for instance, they happen to be ruminants, right? Mm-hmm. So on the outside, it looked as though that was a pretty simple food chain, but it's not. Because when you enter the stomach of a grazer, what do you find?
Bacteria.
And?
Bacteria.
And?
Archaea, fungi.
And
food.
Protozoans. Complicated stuff. There are ciliates that are there. Mm-hmm. And so what are they doing, Vince? They're actually feeding on the grass that was chewed up into small particles by the gnu.
Okay.
So now you've got another layer to talk about.
They're giving something to the gnu and they're taking something also.
That's correct.
So it's not a simple food chain anymore.
No.
Because the gnu is not eating the parasites.
That's right.
Not the parasites, the protozoans.
The microbes.
I see. So they're participants in the chain, but they're not part of the chain, so that's why we have a web.
This is
so
correct.
These protozoans, these gut microbes, are part of the food web.
That's right.
So anything that is not actually directly consumed.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's, in fact, one of the parts of the title of this paper.
That's right. Food web.
And they say nematomorph parasites indirectly alter the food web. So now it sounds like we're going to talk about a parasite impinging on the food chain in some way, right?
Or, in this case, it's a freshwater stream.
Right.
And you know my love of fishing. So,
in fact, they even talk about trouts in this paper.
They do.
That's probably why you found it.
No. Well, I was attracted to it after I saw the editors chose it also. But when I saw that they were dealing with how energy enters the stream from the land in the form of crickets, I was intrigued because crickets don't ordinarily go into water. So something has to make them.
But when they do, trout will eat them, right?
That's correct. But so in this case, they're their desire to jump and essentially commit suicide. So this parasite that is
So this is the nematomorph, right?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, that's a great question.
I asked you that 10 minutes ago.
No, but I got to tell you that
they even have a Wikipedia page.
It doesn't matter if you ask me what it is. I still can't tell you. It's related to nematodes.
So that's why the nemato part
It's
of the
a roundworm.
Okay.
But it's of a different phylum.
Mm-hmm.
All right. There's a whole subgroup of, there are two phyla. Phyla Nematoda.
Right.
And in this case, Nemertina. And so you've got the nematomorphs on one side and the nematodes on the other side. And you can merge them, of course, into a superphylum by finding out that they share certain characteristics. But they're not identical in this sense. Okay, so here we have a parasite as a larva and a free-living worm as an adult.
Wait, whoa, you skipped a life cycle.
Well, I'm just trying to tell you how this works.
So we have a larva. We must have eggs, right?
We must have eggs.
Where are they laid?
That's one of the mysteries of this group.
We don't know.
This is an odd group, Vince. This is a very odd group.
What does it mean to be odd?
Odd in the sense that it's little studied and little understood as the result.
Yet there are a lot of them around, apparently.
There are over 2,000 species of these nematomorphs, and they have another name. They're called horsehair worms,
or Gordian worms.
Gordian worms.
What's a Gordian worm?
Well, it's if you go back into Greek history, you will find that there's something called the Gordian knot. All right.
Yes.
And the Gordian knot is a very special kind of a tie. If you have a rope, you can tie one, but they're very difficult to tie. These worms tie themselves up in knots as adults, and that's where they acquired this nickname.
The Gordian knot is actually a metaphor, right?
It is a metaphor.
For what? For a problem it's hard to solve, right?
Right. But it can be solved, but it's very difficult to solve.
You have to go outside the box.
You have to go outside the box.
Gordian worms. So they tie themselves in knots. So these can be big, right?
They can be very large.
Wow.
And free living. That is to say that the adult version of this sometime parasite is totally free from its host. All right. The adult worm lives free.
And the adults have eggs inside them.
They do, but I'm confused, even from my perspective as a parasitologist, as to how a worm that lives in a stream gets the eggs to a cricket that lives on the land. That's a mystery. Okay? That's a big mystery for me. Now, crickets, what do crickets do, Vince? Do you know how they make their living?
They chirp.
What do they eat?
No idea. Leaves.
Another big mystery here. Is a cricket...
Aren't they leaf cutters?
Are they herbivores? Are they carnivores? Are they entomophagus? How do they get these eggs that hatch inside?
Well, they say here the larvae are used to enter hosts. So the adults have eggs inside them.
Yes.
They hatch, although I'm not sure if they hatch inside or outside.
Oh, they hatch inside, so they give birth to live larvae.
Larvae come out, and then those have to infect the cricket host in this
how?
case. They say they have hooks, but that's all they say.
No, it doesn't say how the larvae get from the river to the land.
We don't know. So it is clear that the worms give birth to larvae in the water.
I think that's true. that's another part of this whole thing.
Maybe they come out of the water and go onto land to lay their larvae, and then the larvae go find some crickets.
It's possible.
And how far are we talking about here? A few feet away from
a few feet.
It's not very far. It's not down the road or anything.
No, it's the ecotone between the forest and the river. That's the bank itself. So what these people have decided to focus on is the behavioral aspect of parasitism in a cricket due to a nematomorph worm. So
is this the so before you do that, I have a question.
Yeah.
These nematomorph worms, do they only infect crickets or
Orthopterans in general?
What's an orthopteran?
I thought you'd ask. Crickets and grasshoppers. Katydids fall into the same category.
It says also beetles and cockroaches.
It says that too, but those are
crustaceans.
Apparently.
All right. And you said that the larval form is parasitic.
Yes.
Because it lives within the
and is known to induce behavioral changes
insect.
in their intermediate hosts.
But the adults swim around.
Apparently,
so they're not parasitic.
They're not.
All right, so here we have an example of an animal that, depending on the cycle of its life, is either parasitic or not.
Do we know another one?
My question exactly.
Well, Strongyloides.
Strongyloides, I knew it.
That's right.
They told me this morning.
No. But Vince,
I'm not that smart.
But yeah, sure. That has nothing to do with being smart. Just memory cells. That's not being smart or not.
So Strongyloides, what form is not parasitic?
Well, it has a whole life cycle that it can occur in feces in the soil.
And that is Strongyloides is what?
It's a nematode.
Thank you.
And we actually had a whole show on that.
I'm going to look it up right now I can tell people.
Yeah. Which episode?
Probably quite old because we have been cranking them out lately.
That's correct. This was early on.
Trachuncula, Trichuris, Malaria, Wolbachia. You can keep talking.
It's before that. It's before that.
I'm getting dizzy, Dickson.
With knowledge. Vincent's getting dizzy with knowledge.
Malaria. Well, we had a lot of malaria. Hey, look, it's Chuck, Peter Hotez, Bob Quads. Trematodes? No.
No. It's all nematodes.
Schistosome?
No.
Eukarya?
No.
Onchocerca?
I think it's early.
Wow.
It's around the hookworms and the trichurises and the...
Strongyloides.
There you go.
Stercoralis.
And which number was that?
That's 23.
We waited that long to talk about it. Okay.
And I'm going to look at the life cycle here.
Look at how easy this website is to use. Vince, you've created a beauty.
We have some free-living soil cycles here, yeah.
We do.
So that's the part where it's not parasitic.
That's right.
But most of the other parasites that we have discussed, in fact, are parasitic for their entire life cycle. Is that correct?
But that's not correct, actually, because the tapeworms and the trematodes have stages that can exist outside the host as free-swimming stages.
Okay.
But those are brief in time. They have to find a host in a hurry in order to complete the life cycle. The nematomorph worm, adult, lives its entire life outside of the host.
So one of the puzzles then, as we move on, is how the worm goes from the water to the land to get to the crickets. Get to the cricket.
That's
and
right.
You're puzzled because you don't think this worm could just crawl up on the bank and grow legs. And
I didn't say it couldn't do that. I never said it couldn't. But I didn't see any literature that told me that's what happens. Okay. So maybe that is what happens. And perhaps one of our listeners can find an obscure reference to the life cycle of some of these horsehair worms for us, and we can share those with the rest of the people.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I'm going to do some more research on this too, but I just thought this was such an exciting article for what it says about the connectivity between land and aquatic environments, and it's all driven by parasites, that we should feature that on our show today.
I think this is a really interesting topic, which is actually something we've touched on quite a bit, the manipulation of the host by the parasite.
Right.
We've talked about it for toxoplasma.
We did. That's right.
Tapeworms even,
That's
right?
True.
The neuroform.
Yes.
Neurocysticercosis, right?
And for schistosomes, there are some that infect snails, and the snail behaves differently, and as the result attracts the attention of a bird, and the bird then becomes infected because it drew attention to itself, basically.
There's another one mentioned here.
Yes.
There's a trematode that insists in the foot of the cockle.
Exactly.
Cockle's a little bivalve.
Yeah, it's a
clam, right?
Mollusk.
Yeah. People like to eat them.
They do.
And apparently, when this trematode infests the cockle, the foot, it can't dig as deep into the sand.
That's right.
And then the birds eat them.
Exactly.
And I guess the parasite wants to be in the bird.
You got it.
Amazing.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
Wasn't there one where the insect grows something on its snail or something that makes it visible to the bird also?
That's the one I just referred to.
So this cockle story is very interesting.
It is.
I looked up a couple of papers, and can I digress just a minute?
Absolutely.
And we'll put some links to these. There's a paper in Parasitology, 1998. It's called Manipulation of a Mollusk by a Trophically Transmitted Parasite.
Trophically. That is up through the food web.
So here, how does the parasite, in this case a trematode, get into the cockle?
has to be eaten.
The cockle eats it.
Or one of the stages of this nematode actually penetrates the foot, like the Sicaria does for us.
Now, in addition, they found that besides making these cockles vulnerable to birds eating them, the infestation by the nematode makes them more vulnerable to another parasite. It's a castrating sporocyst of another nematode. A castrating sporocyst. I guess it makes it sterile, right?
Right. Sounds that way.
So not only does it make its behavior change so it is eaten by the bird, but it also allows other parasites to get into this.
Indeed.
And I found a very nice Wikipedia page on cockles.
Very nice.
And I found a paper from a French group who did their work near Arcachon, which is right on the western coast of France. And we used to go there all the time. I love it. And they studied the distribution of these nematodes in cockles on the shores.
Right.
They do that in the morning, then they go for lunch.
That's right.
It's wonderful.
So
they say here
yeah.
that in coastal systems, nematodes are the most prevalent parasites of marine mollusks.
How about that?
And we're always eating these, especially raw.
We are.
Oysters.
Right.
I had some raw oysters the other day. I probably ate some nematodes, right?
You have to feel lucky that you're not a bird, otherwise you'd be infected with them.
So they can't infect me.
Right.
Are oysters mollusks?
Sure.
Okay, so they probably had nematodes.
Yeah.
I felt a little funny afterwards. I think that's why it's good to put the oyster in vodka.
You think?
Get rid of the nematodes. Anyway, so this is a whole paper that examines just the distribution of this. And I thought it was interesting that it was Arcachon Bay.
Yeah.
Because I really like Arcachon Bay.
Nice.
Okay.
Very nice.
Thank you for allowing me to divert.
That's not a diversion, Vince. Parasitism brings you to incredibly distant shores, ecologically speaking.
I never appreciated this.
And then it brings you back to
virology has not yet done that.
That's not true. I can't. Come on. West Nile virus, the way it infects all those other life forms, and then
I never thought of it that way. That's
networks.
Right. You know why I always think of virus in the lab.
Yeah. See, look inside of a cell. It's complicated as heck. It's more complicated than ecosystems.
Thank you for broadening my view of this.
No, Vince. I think we complement each other on this.
Because I've always had a focus on the virus in the cell, in the lab, studying the minutia of replication.
Understood.
But now if you back off, viruses are just another parasite.
They are.
Can viruses alter the food web? For sure.
Absolutely.
In the seas, they lyse bacteria in blue-green algae or cyanobacteria.
Of course.
And protists. Oh, my gosh.
They sequester carbon just by being there.
All right, back to the nematomorph in the cricket.
Right. So
we have to call this Jiminy Cricket.
We will call
something
it
like that.
That's right. So let's talk about the ecosystem that they're discussing first. This is a freshwater lotic.
What did you say?
Freshwater lotic ecosystem.
What's lotic?
Means LOTIC. Lotic means moving water. We can look that one up just to make sure I'm correct.
All right,
on this
I'll look it up while you.
There are two kinds of aquatic freshwater ecosystems that are commonly referred to: lotic and lentic.
Lotic refers to flowing water,
and lentic refers to standing water, like lakes. So this is a lotic ecosystem that we're discussing. Okay, and it's a freshwater lotic ecosystem, which has trout in it.
This is in Japan, right?
It's in Japan. So isn't this interesting that actually these are not trout? I should qualify this. These are char.
Isn't that a trout?
It's a salmonid, but it's not a trout.
They call it trout here.
I know they do, but they
call it kirikuchi char.
They don't want to keep saying char. I think they just want to use
a
common char.
I've had Arctic char.
I have too.
It's wonderful.
It's delicious.
So basically it's in the trout family?
It's in the salmonid family.
Are trouts in the salmonid family?
They are.
All right. Can we do this weekend fishing?
We'll be here forever.
Couldn't you do a monthly chat on fishing? People do that, right?
They do that already.
Well, we could do it from the ecological perspective.
Well, we are doing it now from the ecological.
All right.
So we're going to delve a little bit into stream ecology here because we've got some terms that might not be familiar.
Yes.
And you started out asking me what the word benthic meant.
Yeah.
Benthic. Okay,
well, we haven't mentioned benthic to the listeners
We
yet.
have not, but we will soon.
So wait on the benthic. There are a couple of early, let's see.
So the system that these people decided to study was energy flow and food web organization of a terrestrial interface to a low-tick freshwater ecosystem. That's the official terminology for this. So in essence, they were studying how trout behave with regards to their food sources and what effect the food source might have on the outcome of energy flow in that stream.
Okay, got it.
Right? So the energy is in the form of food, of course.
Right.
So what do trout eat?
Well, I think normally they eat benthic something.
They're carnivores.
They eat flies that land on the surface.
Yeah, they'll eat. They're pretty adaptable, actually.
So whatever an insect lands on the surface, they'll go up and eat it, right?
They will.
Which is why you can catch them with a fly.
That's correct.
But do they eat other things on the bottom?
They do.
Like what?
Well,
benthic something?
Well, the bottom is the benthic.
What does benthic mean?
It's another term for the bottom.
Oh.
It just means the bottom.
Benthic Jiminy Cricket. A title is coming to me.
How about Jiminy Cricket's bottoms up? So, at any rate, we'll work on this one too. I guarantee you. So,
what do the trout eat on the bottom?
The cold water ecosystems that are moving waters have in them a series of what they call macro invertebrates.
Oh, it's called the benthic community.
That's
right?
correct. So macro invertebrates. So an invertebrate is
you can see with your naked eye, right?
Animal with no backbones.
Give me an example. A copod?
Yep. If you could see it, yeah. Some of them you can see.
You can't see rotifers?
Mostly you can't see rotifers with your naked eye.
All right, what can you see?
Well, you can see insects.
They live on the bottom?
They do.
Oh, okay.
In fact, they live underneath the rocks.
Okay.
The reason why they don't live on top of the rocks is because the trout are there.
The trout would just pick them off, right?
And they do pick them off.
So they have good eyesight, these trout?
They have awesome eyesight. Awesome. Their whole way of hunting is by eyesight. They have no chemical hunting mechanisms that we know of. They hunt by looking.
So the trout can eat macro invertebrates on the bottom, or insects and arachnids on the top.
Well, arachnids don't usually fall into this, but some spiders would get into the water sometimes.
Yeah, a spider could sit on the water gliders. Those are not arachnids.
No, they're not. Those are still insects. But some of these macro invertebrates, they live as larvae underneath the rocks, but when they hatch, they can fly away. What
an amazingly complex system.
It is.
There's more than meets the eye, isn't there?
Much more than meets the eye. To know what a trout feeds on, you'd have to turn over every rock and scrape it off and bring it back to the lab and study them. And that's been done.
Or take the trout and see what's in their stomach.
They do that too.
Which is in this paper.
They do that too.
Wow.
So what they're really concerned about here is, does a terrestrial source of food alter the feeding patterns of trout to the extent where it will create a change in the benthic macroinvertebrate population?
Why is that of interest at all? Does it cure diseases?
Of course not. It might cure a disease of the earth. What they're really interested in...
I'm being a devil's advocate, I know. Because I think this is wonderful.
I think the reason why these people do this kind of work is because they want to study nature's ways. And this is the way nature behaves with regards to maintaining life forms in a moving body of water, which is not an easy thing to do. Okay. It's a variable environment from start to finish. If you go to the top of where these rivers start, at the tops of these mountains as trickles, and go to the bottom where they end up in rivers, the whole gradient.
It's all different along the way.
Every part of it is different, Vince. And
amazing.
It's, and where do you start and where do you stop? And the answer is you just keep examining all of this. And it matters if you want to measure the effects of human activity on the environment.
Okay.
Because a lot of this
makes sense.
is affected by human activity like deforestation, pollution, warming the water up and changing temperature profiles and stuff like this. All of that will change the mix of who can live there. And sometimes you get bad things living there too. You could even create, disease transmission zones where there were none before that for humans by altering aquatic environments. So it has a larger picture which might include humans, but for the most part, these people exist to study nature in its primal forms. And here they are studying a parasite that has nothing to do with human health whatsoever, but it has something to do with the health of the river. Okay, the health of the river is the main focus of this paper. So here's, in essence, should we just say what they found first and then how they found it later?
Well, what is the connection between the cricket and the nematomorph in the water? Can you just outline that general thing?
Sure. Crickets, without this parasite, have an aversion for water.
Really?
So crickets...
Like cats.
Right. Crickets don't ordinarily...
Is that why when a cat has toxo, it goes in the water? Never mind.
No, cats don't go in the water, but it's the mice and the rats when they get toxo. That's what happens to them.
So the crickets normally are terrestrial animals.
And they stay there. This is the camel cricket.
And they eat both plants and animal.
Well, I think crickets are omnivores, but I think someone out there would probably correct me on this one. I don't know what crickets derive for most of their food. They have the ability to chew a lot of things because they have big mouth parts. But grasshoppers do too, and they're strict herbivores, so maybe crickets are strict herbivores as well.
All right.
But somehow they have to acquire this parasite. So maybe...
We don't know how that happens.
We don't know how it happens, but maybe the larvae do crawl out of the river and get onto leaves, and then these crickets eat the leaves and get the parasite.
And then the larva matures into an adult long worm, and they show it coming out of the cricket. It actually comes out of the anus.
Yes. So the cricket
must be difficult for the cricket.
The cricket is the definitive host for this parasite.
And does the... Oh, I'm jumping the gun. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. So the cricket ingests the eggs. The eggs hatch. The larvae, I'm sure, go through 4 molts. Maybe if they're anything like nematodes, but I'm not sure how many molts metamorphs go through in order to become adults. But the adult worm ends up in the water. Somehow you have to get an organism that has a great aversion for water to go into the water. It's like getting the cricket to commit suicide, basically.
How does it do that?
Well, we don't know the mechanism, but we do know what happens.
At what point? As an adult, cricket the worm makes the cricket go in?
It can, but...
That's the picture they have here.
But if you see the adult of this worm, it's quite big.
Yeah. It'd be hard for the cricket to walk.
Exactly right. I think way before that, the cricket has this...
Small worm.
I think I'll go swimming. I mean, what are you thinking about when you say that? This little parasite, as a larva, convinces the cricket that it's a good idea to go near the water.
This in itself would be interesting to study.
Very interesting.
I don't know how you would do it.
Very interesting. Crickets have a typical insect nervous system with a subesophageal ganglia that control various functions. And it's a very interesting and well-organized nervous system. The point is that...
I bet the worms are secreting something that induces this behavior. So you can make extracts of worms and give it to crickets and see if it makes them go into water.
Vince, you've taken that out of the field and into the lab. And
that's what I do.
That's what you do. That's what you do. And I watch you do it, and I stand in awe of you. Because.
And then we could purify the active ingredient.
You could do that.
See how it's regulated.
You could do that.
Wow.
You could do that.
But anyway, what we are left with is that the worm makes the cricket go in the water. Let's take a swim.
Ultimately, the cricket thinks it's a great idea, except it's like saying to somebody that's observing a whole shore full of white sharks that it's a good idea to go swimming. It's not a good idea to go swimming.
So what happens when a cricket jumps into the water? It stays on the surface. It doesn't sink, right?
It does not sink. And the trout in the water look up as well as down for their food. And the moment they see something struggling on the surface, they go up to investigate. If they think it's bite size, it's gone.
That's why fisherman works, right?
Yes.
And they say, "Oh, Dickson's fishing today."
Sometimes.
Do you ever put a cricket on your hook?
Nope, not a live cricket, but I have artificial crickets. I'll bring some in.
Do they have nematodes in them? Nematomorphs.
No, I am the equivalent to that. I put the cricket in the water.
That's correct.
What would cause a cricket to jump into the water?
Actually, when I think about it, you're using a bait based on parasitism.
In some cases.
Because the trout would know that sometimes crickets jump in the water.
So
right?
What's another way to get a cricket in the water without having a parasite do it?
You throw it in.
Yeah, that's one
I don't
way.
know.
No. How about a high wind?
Oh, okay.
How about a fire?
They would run from the heat and get in the water, yeah.
Sure.
All right, so trouts are basically used to getting these bugs on the surface.
Or how about an animal that's walking along the shore of a river, the bank of a river, and scares the insects towards the water?
Yeah, okay.
I know this is an aside. You took an aside. I'll take an aside. In Yellowstone Park, there's a hill within the park along the Madison River in the park called Grasshopper Hill. And in the late summer, like August and early September, there's the grasshopper season for fishing for trout. And there's always a lot of wind in these places. And so as grasshoppers develop their wings and they begin to fly to mate, if there's a strong wind and it's blowing in the right direction, the grasshoppers will fly and land in the water occasionally. And the trout will know this eventually, and they'll all start to line up near the bank of the river where the wind is blowing off of, and that's how they get their food in the summer when the mayflies and the stoneflies and the caddisflies are in low supply. There's this apocryphal story of a fly fisherman who had a Labrador retriever that would run up and down the bank of Grasshopper Hill when there was no wind and scare the grasshoppers into the...
He knew he was doing that?
In the water. Of course he did. Of course he knew it. And he could start a hatch, basically, of grasshoppers simply by allowing his dog to run back and forth on this hill. And eventually you could start to see the trout rise because they make a big splash when they go for the grasshoppers. Sure. And this guy used to catch a lot of fish, apparently. So we would call that chumming.
Yeah, sure.
You're not allowed. That's kind of like non-sportsmanlike behavior. But,
it's when you go out on a fishing boat at sea, they throw chum in.
Yeah, they do. Because they want you to catch some fish to take them back home. But, okay, so another way to get a land-dwelling animal into the water, apparently, is to infect them with nematomorph parasites.
Right.
It alters their behavior. They lose their fear of water. They take a swim. The next thing you know, they get eaten by a trout. So crickets are pretty big.
And that puts the worm in the water.
It puts the worm in the water.
But sometimes the trout must eat the worm.
They do, and then in that case, I think the worm is destroyed. But I read this article pretty carefully, as you did too, and part of the article said that as the trout chews its food and the adult worm comes out, it can sometimes escape through the gills.
It said even the anus, so it can apparently go through the tract and not get digested.
That's right.
It must be evolution, selection, right?
It must be, but eventually, of course, the adult worms end up in the river.
So the worms are in the river, which is where they want to be.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Why, we don't know.
We don't.
They can wiggle around. You think they go to the bottom?
They don't dehydrate that way.
They probably go to the bottom and mature.
Yeah. Most of the nematomorph life cycles that I tried to read about in this short time all were found in aquatic situations of mud and little puddles of water and things of this sort. So they're all basically moisture-dwelling adult free-living worms.
So we have this wonderful cycle.
Yeah. The big story here
is... What's the big deal?
Right. Well, the point is that crickets, that's a big meal. It's a Big Mac compared to, a little slider that you'd get at some hamburger stand. This is a gigantic piece of biomass that the trout has suddenly come upon.
Right.
And so what they did was they tried to manipulate certain portions of two rivers, which were pretty much identical, except that one river had crickets that had a good life cycle going on, and the other river didn't.
All right, let me ask you a question.
Please.
So if you give the cricket a Big Mac, you give the trout a Big Mac,
in the form
it's
of
not hungry. Cricket. So what is it not going to eat? The stuff on the benthic stuff on the bottom, right?
Well, it's less likely to because.
And what would the effect of that be?
Well, that's exactly what they were looking.
If you have more. So these benthic communities of macroscopic invertebrates, they would proliferate.
Yeah, they would.
So you can see how the parasite affects a food web, right? Am I getting this right?
That's the whole story.
All right.
And
they wanted to test it, basically.
They did. They wanted to see how much of an effect crickets infected with nematomorph parasites diverted the feeding behavior of little trout and big trout for the macroinvertebrates on the bottom of the river. And they conducted these experiments in a very sophisticated way. And, I must stop here and just say how difficult these studies are. Because
why are they difficult?
Because
these are outside. These are field studies.
Not only outside, you're dealing with intact running water ecosystems. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to not alter them, but at the same time affect them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, that's what Schrodinger always talked about. As soon as you study something, you alter it.
No kidding. So you have to have controls.
Yeah.
Right, and that's why they had this one river that had no parasites associated with it, just crickets, and just to see what that.
Yeah.
What they ended up showing, and I thought it was fantastic. The conclusion that they ended up with was that if you feed trout a new source of food, which has nothing to do with the bottom-dwelling macroinvertebrates, you will divert their attention away from the macroinvertebrates. And so more macroinvertebrates will survive.
Right.
As more survive, then you can say, well, so what? What do they do? What does a macroinvertebrate do? Mm-hmm. What does one do? It's not a simple answer to this question because... Vince, have you ever looked into a fly fisherman's equipment?
No.
To see how many different flies they go?
I assume there are lots.
Well, some fish with a few, but most of us...
And yours?
If I were to bring these in for you and show you how many fly boxes worth of flies I fish with, and how many sizes of each fly I fish with, it would give you some idea of the complexity of these freshwater aquatic ecosystems as to the kinds, sizes, shapes, and colors of mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies. There are a tremendous number of variations here, like 600 different species of mayflies just in the east, 2,000 different species of caddises, and hundreds of species of stoneflies. And the fish, it's like going to your favorite restaurant and ordering up a meal. If the chef doesn't have that ingredient, you don't get the meal. You get another kind of meal. And if you're hungry, you'll eat it. And trout are totally dependent upon the river that they live in for their food. So each river supplies a different ratio of each one of those things, right? The moment you start to alter it, you're going to get a change in the way energy flows from the river to the trout. Now, when I said a simple food chain was the sun, grass, grazers, and carnivores, let's take that same analogy and apply it to the river. So you have sun, right? But grass doesn't usually grow in a river, right?
Yep.
There are some rivers that...
On the bottom, something grows, though.
There are some rivers that happens with, and
that's
limestone rivers.
In fact, I was taught that that's how you can tell which direction the water is flowing.
Correct.
Just look at the grass on the bottom.
That's right. So we have two different kinds of rivers to talk about. One in which the food for the insects grows in the river itself. That's a limestone stream. Mm-hmm. There are very few examples of those throughout the world. And then there's this other kind of river called the freestone stream. The round rocks that everybody's used to, and they're hard to walk on, and the insects live underneath the rocks. Okay. Now, where does the food for that come from? It doesn't come from the plants because there are no plants in those rivers. So it's a mystery as to where the energy comes from. The sun shines, and somehow it translates into energy flow from the sun to something to the river. And you know what it turns out to be, Vince?
Algae.
That's part of the answer. Mm-hmm. And the other part is leaves.
Leaves that fall in from the trees nearby, yeah.
But only at a certain time of the year.
Okay.
So if you're dealing with mostly hardwood, forest, freestone, trout streams,
right,
the majority of the energy comes in September, October, and November.
I see, when the leaves are falling in. Huh?
Right. And so who eats the leaves?
That's a good question. I'm sure you know.
Trout. don't eat the leaves.
No, they don't eat. But these benthic things.
The benthic macroinvertebrates feast.
They're called the shredders.
Some of them shred the leaves.
Some of them chew them up. I don't know why they call them shredders. Do they have teeth?
No, but they've got interesting mouth parts.
They shred up the leaves.
They do.
And do the algae eat pieces of the leaves?
Algae don't. No, but algae will grow on the leaf.
The algae are made from photosynthesis,
That's
right?
correct. That's
and
correct.
So they grow on the leaf, and then the shredders, when they're shredding, do they eat those as well?
They do. But in fact, some shredders won't eat a leaf that's got no algae on it.
They want to scrape the algae off.
So I liken that to a Big Mac. You have to have the special sauce. So basically, it's complicated. They're called phycomycetes. Most of the fungal growths on leaves occur in succession as the leaf breaks down in the river.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is really off the subject of parasitism and virology.
But this is all affected by the parasite.
All of it.
We have to establish the system before we can talk of the effect of the parasite.
That's right. I just want you to look at the layers of complexity in a freshwater ecosystem. Let's take an oak leaf.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think it takes an oak leaf after it falls off the tree and goes to the bottom of one of these rivers? How long do you think it takes for it to be completely consumed?
2 weeks.
Keep guessing.
Am I off by too much or too little?
You're not even close.
Wait, let me try a day.
No, the other way.
A month.
Keep going.
6 months.
Just about right.
Oh, so it lasts a long time down there.
It does. So that's like a time release capsule for the energy that was trapped in the leaf by the sun.
Wow.
So
neat.
Here's another question for you.
And that's providing food for the food chain.
Correct. Actually, it's a food web in this case. It's a food web.
You got a leaf. You have the microbes growing on the leaf, and then the macro invertebrates eating the microbes
and the
trout
leaf.
are eating the macro.
But there are some insects there that will eat each other.
Okay, it's a web.
It's a web. Here's another question for you then. Forget the oak trees. What if you're a maple tree and the leaf falls in the river? How long does that take to be completely consumed?
6 months?
It's shorter.
3 months.
Make it 4 months.
Okay.
So
why? It attracts a different community.
It's a different biochemistry of this leaf.
Okay.
These are different. So the way they determine this is they take a burlap bag, right, and they can fill it with just one kind of leaf at a time.
They put it in the water and see how long it
and they withdraw
lasts. Yeah,
and they put a rock in the bottom to make sure it doesn't go away.
In this study, they did some leaf.
Yeah, they did.
Stuff.
They did. So they've worked all of this out now.
So they wanted to know if you put crickets in for the trout and only crickets. So they had to isolate pieces of this stream with mesh.
Yeah.
And then make sure only crickets go in, cover it up when you're not feeding them.
That's right.
And then they had put leaves in, and they're measuring the trout, what they're eating, see if they're eating benthic things, the amount of the benthic things, the community. They put leaves in to see how those are. Really complicated experiments.
That's why there's so many authors on this paper.
Wow.
Every one of them got stuck basically doing just one thing because there's so many parts to this study. But it's a beautiful study in the sense that
it's only a 3-month study.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was done in France. No, sorry.
No,
Japan.
That's right. It was done during the time of maximum degradation of leaves in these small streams that they were looking at. If you went back in the ecological literature prior to 1970,
right,
the stream ecologists were still struggling with where the energy for the river came from. They still didn't fully accept the fact that dead leaves were important to the energy flow from land to the river. So the point is that if you want to kill a trout stream, all you have to do is cut down the trees along the banks, and you'll eliminate the possibility of leaves going in the river. If you do that, the trout will die because they won't have anything to eat.
Right.
Because their macroinvertebrates will be gone. The best way to make a trout stream work without that is to take bags of leaves that you've raked off your lawn and bring them to the river and throw them in, which we've done, by the way. We've actually done that. So
you know all this stuff.
Well, I don't know all of this stuff, but this used to be part of a course that we taught called Trout Stream Ecology to adult education.
Wow, that would be a cool course to talk about these Nematomorpha.
We didn't, and I would have loved to have had this as an example of something to talk about.
Can I just mention here some of the way they do this study?
Please. Yeah.
So they had 2 study streams.
Right.
And one of them, it said here, they have similar in-stream characteristics and riparian vegetation. What's riparian mean?
That's the riparian zone of a river is the bank of the river.
Okay. They would divide this into blocks of 3 treatment. Each stream had 2 blocks of 3 treatments. Within a block, the 3 treatments were randomly assigned to 3 26-meter-long reaches.
That's right. A reach is a length of a river.
And they would put wire netting to separate so they could do different things.
That's right. Because they were putting 2 different sizes of trout in there, too, right?
They didn't want the trout to go back and forth.
That's correct.
And then they would put crickets in.
That's right.
And then cover it at night so that no more bugs could go in.
That's right.
And then they had another one that was completely covered all the time so nothing would go in.
That's right.
And in these, they would have the fish, and they would put leaves in to measure the shredding.
And how did they check the fish? They call it electrofishing.
Oh, that's right. I meant to mention. So they would take all the fish out by electrofishing. What is it? They electrocute the water?
They do.
And the fish float to the surface.
They do.
And they
They're
scoop them up
stunned.
and take them home to eat?
No. No, Vince.
Because they're putting fish back in, right?
No, those same fish. It just stuns them.
And why do they want to repopulate with certain sizes, big fish and little fish?
When they did that, they want to check on how much they've grown and what they're eating.
Right, but initially, they depleted some.
Oh, yeah, because then you wanted to restock it with just the same size fish that you wanted.
Okay.
That's correct.
So you get some medium-sized fish you're not putting back, and presumably you're taking them home to eat, right? Or putting them in some other river.
They put them in some river.
Okay. Right. Yes, and then when they do, they put shrimp, they put the crickets in, or they put other things in, or they don't put anything in.
Yeah.
And then periodically they would measure the fish to see how they're growing. They'd look in their stomach to see what they're eating.
Correct. And then they looked under the rocks to see the benthic communities of insects.
Look at the leaves.
They looked at the leaves.
Amazing.
They did everything.
Such a complicated
Fantastic.
study. But it's a nightmare in a way because you set up your thing, then you go home at night, and who knows what's going to happen out there?
You don't. And what if there was a rainstorm and a flood? That wipes out the whole thing.
Yeah, because you can't. Again. Yeah, you can't have that water going in.
Earthquakes. You get a lot of earthquakes in Japan too, right?
Wow.
I know.
Now I was really impressed. Leaf packs.
They're amazing. It was just amazing.
They have to dry them.
Yes.
And then put them. They weigh them and put them, and then they take them back to the lab and see how much is left of them. Oh, it's amazing.
Exactly.
So what did they find?
Ha! Well, ultimately what they found was that if the trout food of the river is supplemented by crickets, it diverts their attention away from the benthic organisms,
right?
Which can then maintain higher population levels. And there's less algae on the rocks,
right?
And the leaf litter disappears faster.
It disappears faster?
Yeah, because there's more benthic organisms to eat them.
Well, the algae don't actually degrade the leaves.
No.
It's the benthics that shred them.
Scrapers and shredders. And Vince, I have one other more aside to tell you about here.
Yeah, of course.
To just show you another level of complexity here. Rivers, most rivers are gradations from high zones to low zones. All right, so altitude-wise. So as the gradient decreases as you go down a river, the river slows down, it gets bigger, wider, deeper. Okay? But if you take the middle stretch of the river, of most rivers, it's got a certain structure to it. So it's rapids, then there's a deep pool, and then it shallows out, and then there's a rapids, a deep pool, it shallows out, a rapids, a deep pool, it shallows out. And each rapid is the area of substrata, okay, the substrate that the river grows over, that's resistant to erosion.
Okay.
So it stays put. But just below that, there's a zone that is etched out by the river's motion. And you get these big, deep zones. And then you get into another strata down from that that's also more resistant, and that's your rapids. So you got rapids, pools, rapids, pools, rapids, pools, rapids. Okay, so at the top of the pool where the rapids are.
Right.
You have communities of benthic organisms that are completely different than the middle deep pool or the bottom just before the next rapids.
Right.
Now, what I want you to know about is the caddisflies. Okay, caddisflies. What are caddisflies anyway? And it's an enormous group of insects found throughout the world. Mm-hmm. And they have a complex life cycle. But one of the parts of the life cycle is a larval life cycle. And they live underneath the rocks. And many of them spin webs just like spiders. Now get this. Get this one.
In the water.
On the rocks. They live inside these little tents that they make.
And they spin webs in the water.
They spin webs in the water.
Wow.
Now, that's number one.
Have you seen such webs?
I have. Number two is that each species of caddis spins a web that has different size openings.
Okay, to catch different sized prey.
They don't catch prey. They feed on particles of detritus. They're detritivores. They're called detritivores.
From the shredded leaves.
Yes.
Wow.
And the shredders make different sizes when they eat. Some particles are big, some are smaller, some are smaller. Now you can imagine if your web is so big that it only catches the big particles. Right. The little ones or the littler ones go through, and that's further downstream for the ones that have narrower openings. And finally, at the bottom, just before it goes to the next rapids, they're as fine as you can possibly imagine to catch every last little particle. And out from the web comes the caddis larva, and it sort of grazes off of what it's caught by its web. That's incredible complexity.
It's amazing.
I'm
amazed. And now I really appreciate you, Dickson. The paper has catalyzed my appreciation of why you fish and do
finally.
Yes.
No, I love the complexity of it because it's as complicated as walking inside of a cell and trying to figure out how it works.
Yeah, it's just that it's
a bigger cell.
Wow, it's big. You could actually walk into it.
You can.
Let me ask you a few questions.
Please.
First, I love the figures because they have standard bar graphs, but they have little pictures of trouts.
They do.
And crickets and shredders.
That's right.
And benthies, they call them.
That's
benthies. Right. All right, that's beautiful.
It helps you visualize what they've done.
Yeah, you have to see this paper. I hope it's
ecologists are very good at expressing visual data. They're very good at this.
A couple of their conclusions. First,
yes.
Reduced predation pressure on benthic invertebrates. That's by giving the trout crickets.
Right.
There's less predation pressure on the benthic invertebrates. Led to increases in invertebrate biomass.
Right.
Of course, there's more of them.
Of course.
And changes to community structure.
Yes.
Okay. So this is all presumably naturally this could happen when the parasite makes the crickets go in the water. It could change the community structure, right?
Correct.
So they're duplicating this artificially by throwing crickets in the water, but in effect, you can see how this parasite could alter the structure.
Exactly.
Increases in the benthic invertebrates led to reductions in their resources, which are the algae, right?
And the leaves.
Now, why the leaves again?
Because they eat the leaves too. That's what their food
the more
is.
benthics, they shred up the leaves.
Exactly.
Okay. And then, is there another thing? One more thing. They call this... They say nematomorph parasites create a resource subsidy for trout in the form of manipulated crickets. What is a resource subsidy? It's like giving you money to go. It's like food stamps.
Right.
Why?
It's like, in the wintertime when your cattle are out in the middle of a field and they're starving to death and you come out with your truck and throw bales of hay out for them.
That's a resource subsidy.
That's a subsidy over what the land could produce for itself.
So these worms are providing a resource subsidy.
Yeah, in the way of a behavioral change in crickets. That's fantastic.
They call it a cricket subsidy.
That's fantastic.
That's the name of our podcast, the Jiminy Cricket Subsidy.
It's
that
amazing.
Can alter the whole structure of this stream environment.
So that brings me to my largest point.
Okay.
And as a parasitologist, I've lived with this kind of story in other ways, which always at the end shows you that as complicated as you think the Earth is in terms of its life forms and its relationships, It's nothing compared to the way it really is. It's much more complicated and much more integrated and much more opportunistic and resilient. This shows you some resilience here. I'll tell you why, Vince, because there's a time in the river where the macroinvertebrates are low in numbers, okay? Most of them have hatched out during the year.
So what do the trout eat?
That's right. What do they eat? They turn to these terrestrial life forms for food.
On the surface.
They do. Can I have one more diversion before
You have as many as you want. I don't think listeners mind your diversion.
I hope not, because
you're a good storyteller.
Well, actually, these are other people's stories, but but I like repeating them. So the story that I loved to tell in my ecology course was a study done by Mary Power and her group at Berkeley.
Was it a good powered study?
It's a very good powered study. She's a member in the National Academy of Sciences, too. Mary Power and her students went to some trout streams in California. She's teaching at Berkeley. I hope she's still there. And what they did was they built cages. Okay, they were looking at rivers that had runs of salmon and steelhead trout in them. Okay, so in upper California, there are rivers like the Klamath and several others that have sea-run trout that go out into the ocean, like most of the salmon are like that. And they come back. And when they come back, they start, not the salmon, but the trout start to eat things, okay? So she said, what role does the top carnivore play in energy flow for the river? So she had an interesting system, because when she built a cage that kept the trout, which were large fish, from eating smaller fish, and in this case they were sticklebacks. Okay. She said, what would be the effect of preventing steelhead trout from eating sticklebacks on the macroinvertebrates and the algae? So I want to ask you to guess, because now you know, now you're armed and dangerous here. You've got the information you need to figure out what happened in her study. So she put cages over certain areas of the river. They anchored them down so they wouldn't get swept away. And that, the trout would come over and see these sticklebacks, but they couldn't get to the sticklebacks. And soon the sticklebacks learned that if they darted inside the cages, they were safe. So now you have to ask me some questions. No, you do.
All right, so...
so trout eat sticklebacks.
Right,
then,
so now there are no more sticklebacks available, or fewer. It's drastic.
I want to know what happens inside the cage.
Where the trout are, or where the sticklebacks are?
Where the trout are not.
So the sticklebacks now exhaust their resources.
Which is what?
Benthics, right?
Yes. Benthic invertebrates.
And so now probably the algae overgrow the leaves.
Absolutely.
And what does that do?
They got these huge plumes of algae growing off the rocks, which, of course, slows down the river, depletes the oxygen, and makes life more uncomfortable for resident fish.
It's all a web, Dickson, isn't it? It's all interrelated.
It was fantastic.
And what happened to the trout?
The moment she lifted up the cages, the trout could eat the sticklebacks.
No, but until then, were they eating something else?
Oh, well, she didn't cage off the whole river.
I see.
She just caged off.
So basically the observation is on the sticklebacks area.
Yes, the trout were fine.
Because they had find other
places to go, sure.
Okay.
But here are these sticklebacks in their refuge.
This is cool. This kind of study must be very rare nowadays, right? Because there's not a lot of money to do this.
There's no money.
It's mostly NSF support,
and people would say, who cares? Right?
Certain people would say, what is it of good, what benefit is it to us?
That's right.
To understand this, make fun of studying flies or worms. This would fall under the same category, but this is understanding how the earth works.
Correct.
Isn't that important to us?
It's very
important. And who knows what would come of it by learning the principles that are embodied in this.
This is very true. What it teaches us is that no matter how deep you look into nature, you will find connections that lead back to us. We can't avoid these connections in our own lives. Eventually, I could relate this all to everything else, of course, because we're part of it.
Right.
So the irony of this, Vince, is that trout fishing is it's not an elitist sport. Salmon fishing probably falls into that category in some cases. But here are some people who you would classify as non-carers as to what happens to the environment. And I can tell you that many of them take up the sport of fly fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? They have to fly to places like Argentina and Chile and New Zealand in order to find an intact trout stream, because the ones they grew up next to are gone. And this is why they're gone, because when you alter one thing, you affect everything else.
I happen to be at the reference part of this manuscript, and there is a paper called Sticklebacks from Greenland. I wonder why. Maybe they use some methodology
to study
the ice, using the same kind of cages.
Mary Powers is not mentioned there, I presume. I didn't see it. I looked for it.
No. Mary Powers, Effects of Fish in River Food Webs.
Bingo, that's the paper.
1990. It's a science paper.
Vince, that's the paper.
I would like to do ecology papers. Let's just start another podcast. Because it's not all going to be parasites.
You need another host then. Because
it sounds to me like you know this stuff.
Well, I know some of it. But
There's another paper here which is interesting. A stomach sampler for use on live fish.
Oh, yeah.
Can you imagine what they did with that? They used it to sample the stomach contents to see what they were eating, because you want to make sure they're eating, well, not only what you feed them, but what have they switched to or switched away from when you're giving them a lot of crickets.
That's right. Orvis sells them.
I love this paper. It's a good pick, Dickson.
Oh, thank you, Vince.
Anything else?
That's plenty.
So it's all interrelated, and the parasites, which comprise 40% of whatever is on Earth. I found a paper that gave a number. Let me just go back to that.
I mean, the number of species, it's just huge.
It says here that parasite species, right, represent at least 40% of known species.
Right.
And they influence spatial patterns of some free-living species, which we've talked about today. They can have huge influences. The last thing I want to say is this is one example, but there are billions more, I'm sure.
There are.
Right?
There are.
And they're probably all slightly different.
Right.
The cockle is I think the best studied one.
Yeah.
Behavioral change affecting food webs. Here we have now a cricket and a nematomorph.
That's right.
And there must be so many others.
There must be so many others.
Should we do more of these in the future?
I'd love to.
Do our listeners like them? Let us know.
They will. They will.
I think a lot of principles are embodied in this.
Yeah.
Should we do a few emails before we wrap it up?
Absolutely.
Todd writes, "Hello, Dickson and Vincent. Your research and real-life experience is slowly getting summarized by researchers so that it can be understood by reporters, a.k.a. those who have a disproportionately loud voice in society." He sends a link to a New York Times article published on August 25th, 2012, called "An Immune Disorder at the Root of Autism." All right. So the idea is that autism is probably an inflammatory disease. Have you seen this paper or this article?
I've heard rumors of it, but I haven't actually seen it.
Like many other things. So he writes, the article is attempting to tie lack of microbes, parasites, and viruses to inflammatory diseases, which might be a stretch. Excuse me. I don't know if there's a dearth or an abundance of research for either side of this proposed relationship, but it's promising on the surface, and hopefully the political forces at work destroying science in our country won't do the same for this research. Anything that has to do with people is not going to be destroyed, which is important to do, but the kind of research we talked about today shouldn't be destroyed.
Not at all.
An excerpt from the concluding paragraphs. Since time immemorial, a very specific community of organisms, microbes, parasites, some viruses, has aggregated to form the human superorganism. Mounds of evidence suggest that our immune system anticipates these inputs, and that when they go missing, the organism comes unhinged. Have a fantastic week, fellas.
Nice
so
letter.
That's a good point.
That's
and
nice
it
letter.
Actually, the kind of web we discussed today must involve people.
Of course.
Must involve us.
know.
Maybe viruses, bacteria are participating in this kind of web regulation, and when they're perturbed, we have disease states, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's what the next 10 years is going to reveal, I think.
I agree.
Josh writes, "Hello, parasite hosts. I have written TWiP before to express my appreciation for the show. I still appreciate it very much, and it still helps me get through my day's auditing. I ran across this article, which makes this discovery sound like a guaranteed cure for all forms of malaria with just one oral dose. Thinking that was a rather large claim, I did some digging and found the original story. The article is a little more reserved, though not much, with its language. I am interested in what both of you think of this. Is this the wonder drug they make it seem like? So, Dickson, I showed you this yesterday.
You did.
This was an article which summarizes a compound developed in Africa, possible single-dose malaria cure.
Yeah.
It is named MMV390048. It's an aminopyridine class of drugs, and it had some efficacy in mice infected with malaria. Actually, this article is more detailed than the one we had looked at yesterday.
Remember, I raised the question of whether it affected the bloodstream forms only or whether it also attacked the liver stage, because most drugs don't do both. In fact, I don't know a drug that does both of those things.
It says here it displayed a complete cure of animals infected with malaria parasites in a single dose given orally, active against a wide panel of resistant strains of malaria. It doesn't say what strain they're using, but if they're infecting mice, what would it be?
Well, it depends on how they infected them. If it wasn't mosquito-borne and they just injected the parasites intravenously, then it's just the bloodstream form.
And it will go into clinical trials in late 2013.
By the way, to have a drug that would completely wipe out the bloodstream forms would still be a great thing compared to what we have today.
But you would still have the intracellular forms.
Well,
right?
you'd have the liver stages in some parasites, but not others. Falciparum, no, it wouldn't be there because it's only got a single cycle, and that's the end.
Right.
But for Vivax and Ovale, you would have latent liver stages that you'd have to deal with every time it went back out into the bloodstream.
So here are my concerns.
Relapse. Yeah, go ahead.
First, it's a mouse, and many drugs fail.
Yeah, this is true.
When you put them in humans.
This is true.
If it's wiping out all the malaria parasites with one dose, I bet it's really toxic, and there are going to be side effects. If not, then you'll have resistance pretty quickly. So I'm not all that excited.
Yeah, if they attack just one little aspect of the parasite's biology, it's usually easy to jump over that, right?
I think so. Most of the drugs we have,
Sure.
you can develop resistance very readily.
That's right. That's right. In fact, all drugs eventually, I would say.
And in fact, our next letter is from Ricardo, who sent the same article. South African researcher finds single-dose cure for malaria.
Right.
That's the article we looked at yesterday.
Right.
The next one is from Dirk, who writes, Dear parasitology lovers, just came across your blog through recommendation of a colleague and heard your conversation on the worm in the eye.
Ah, yes.
The name seems to be the local meaning of worm, as quoted on page 643 in the book A History of Human Helminthology. That's a Loa, right?
Yep.
So another, someone who was intrigued by our lack of knowledge on the origin of Loa.
Etymologist.
And if I understand correctly, you claim that Kobold was a German. Although being a German myself, Kobold was British, a son of a Suffolk clergyman. That is from Principles and Practice of Clinical Parasitology, 2001, page 3.
I sit corrected.
Not a German. You know who Kobold is, right?
I actually did. It was my mental gymnastics that failed to clear the bar.
But we will be corrected always. This is the beauty of a podcast.
It is.
We have a large audience to keep the facts correct.
This is true.
Lisa writes, Dear Vincent and Dickson, I am a veterinarian with a PhD in virology, and I am in my second year of anatomic pathology residency at the New England Primate Research Center.
Wow, that's a great place.
I just recently discovered the TWiM, TWiV, and TWiP series of podcasts, and they are great.
Oh, good.
I am training for my first marathon, and my long runs were becoming quite tedious with the same old songs on my iPod every day. Now I download another episode of TWiP every time I head out for a long run, and I always have something interesting to listen to. I enjoy TWiM and TWiV, but TWiP is especially great while I am studying for my pathology boards.
Well, glad
Although
to be of help.
TWiP is based mainly around human diseases, most of these are parasites, of course, also quite relevant to veterinary medicine.
Sure.
Your amusing anecdotes and interesting stories help to cement the life cycles of these fascinating creatures in my head, and your entertaining banter makes me feel like I am running with company every time. Thanks for helping the miles fly by, and keep up the good work.
Our pleasure.
And finally, from Rufus, who writes, topic suggestion. I noted recently a news article regarding a treatment method for malaria that addressed the parasite's ability to cause an infected red blood cell to lodge in a capillary and thus avoid being filtered by the spleen. I don't recall you discussing this aspect of the infection. I don't know how effective the treatment is, but the fact that the parasite does this is way cool. Comments, Dr. Despommier?
I thought we did discuss the role of the spleen in sequestering diseased red cells, and in fact, there's a little trick that it plays. It can, the fixed phagocytic cells of the spleen can actually pinch off portions of uninfected red cell and send them back into the circulation because it's trying to conserve as much hemoglobin, and it chews up the rest. So maybe I didn't mention that when we discussed parasitism with malaria, but I will now then.
He sent a link to an article as an example. It's a 1983 PNAS article. It's entitled Parasite Sequestration in Plasmodium falciparum malaria, Spleen and Antibody Modulation of Cytoadherence of Infected Erythrocytes.
All right.
So
we talked about why it sticks to the capillaries, or the precapillaries, I should say. It's got this histidine-rich protein that expresses just under the surface of the red cell membrane that forms a bridge between the endothelial cells, and it sticks as a result of that. And when enough of them stick, then the oxygen tension goes down, and the parasites increase in reproductive strategy.
So they say here sequestration of trophozoite/schizont infected erythrocytes that occurs in intact animals is reduced in splenectomized animals.
Oh, right.
And then you can also interfere with this with an antibody.
Yes.
Antibody can reverse in vivo sequestration.
That's right. The big danger of splenectomy, of course, if this is a childhood disease, is that they're much more susceptible to pneumococcal pneumonia as a result.
I see. And what about using an antibody to interfere with sequestration?
That would be great if we could do it.
Has it been tested ever?
You know who might know about this is Tom Willems.
How would Fidduck know? Would he know?
David, I think David would know that too, sure. Well, let's ask him. We'll get back to you.
We'll get back to you. Let's see. I'll type here on my notes. Ask Fidduck.
Right.
And Rufus, by the way, who just wrote that, is a software engineer.
Oh.
So we get people from all different walks of life.
Love it. Love it.
If you like TWiP, you can find us in iTunes, and you should subscribe there. And, in fact, go leave a comment or rate us. That helps us to stay very visible so that new people discover us, which happens on a daily basis, and that helps us to spread the word about the web, the food web, as you heard today.
That's right.
And other wonderful things about parasites. We're also found at microbeworld.org/TWiP, and you can find the show notes there, and all our letters are reproduced. Send us your questions and comments to twip@twiv.tv. I know it's a little complicated. We have twiv@twiv.tv. We have twim@twiv.tv, and now twip@twiv.tv. I don't have twim.tv and twip.tv. That's why you have to send them all to twiv.tv.
Right.
Got it?
Yeah.
All right.
It's funneling into a narrower food web.
That's right, the food web. Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome, Vincent. It's a pleasure.
We can find Dickson when he's not in his office here.
Or on the Trout stream.
Or on the Trout streams, altering the food webs.
I throw them back.
At trichinella.org, verticalfarm.com, and medicalecology.com. There's a lot of medical ecology here as well, isn't there?
Medicalecology.org.
.org. You should get them both, man. You can't have everything, right?
You can't have everything.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. That's a website that I maintain.
An excellent website.
All about viruses. You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon. Another TWiP is parasitic.